My name is Michael LeSueur. I've been in tech for a good 20 plus years, probably more than I'd like to admit, with the last probably 10 years or so with different security vendors, predominantly on the network solutions side. I've been actually with Vectra for the last 2.5 plus years, depending on how familiar you are with Vectra. We're a threat research and data science company that leverages AI to automate the detection and the prioritization of attacker behaviors surfaced in your enterprise. And these attacker behaviors obviously are targeting hosts and accounts. And then based on machine learning models that drive metrics based on risk and certainty of those attacker behaviors that make up advanced attacks. Another way to kind of think of kind of the essence of what Vectra does is we identify specific behaviors and attacker profiles that are difficult to avoid as a potential enemy moves through the phases of an attack lifecycle or kill chain. And what I mean by that is things like your command and control behaviors, your reconnaissance, lateral movement, and exfiltration. Again, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've talked to or done events with several of the CSA chapters. For the next few minutes, we want to cover some fundamentals that make Office 365 such a rich target for attackers today. Kind of before we start there, let's talk a little bit about what's happening in terms of our environment. You know, everybody speaks to or talks to this concept of digital transformation, and it's been underway for the last 5+ years. Obviously, the pandemic, COVID, accelerated this, in a rapid shift to remote work from home. Now every home office is essentially part of the network. Cloud's rapidly becoming a bigger part of the network, no longer seen as kind of separate or isolated. Everyone now has this concept of ensuring zero trust architecture. And, the three pillars that really make that up are the idea of I've got to protect my endpoints, right? There's where my data resides oftentimes. I've got to harden access to any kind of cloud or data center. And then on top of that, I've got to be able to detect and monitor pretty much everything. But even given what we've done in terms of this migration or digital transformation, attacks remain, attackers and attacks remain well hidden using blind spots that exist between, your data center, IoT, network, and cloud. So let's shift a little bit in terms of talking about this specifically in terms of, software as a service world. Office 365 has dominated the productivity space with now over 250 million active users monthly. I think Teams has hit 145 million active daily users, and it's not slowing down. I think I recently looked at a statistic that basically stated, of all active Office 365 users, half of them are leveraging Microsoft Teams. So Office 365 is the core of the enterprise data sharing, storage, and communications, which just makes it an extremely rich data target. And it's no surprise that Office 365 has become a big focus for attackers as a result of where it sits in terms of importance. And despite the adoption of things like multi-factor authentication or other security controls, financial and reputational damage from Office 365 data breaches really continues to mount. Of the breaches, ATO, or what we refer to as account takeover, is probably the fastest growing and most prevalent. So much so that attackers are focusing on account takeover rather than kind of the traditional email compromise to gain initial access to environments. Microsoft 365 users around the world for the first time generated more than 30 billion collaboration minutes in a single day as people communicated, collaborated, co-authored content across work, life, and learning. This is a pretty amazing new metric that Microsoft is calling out And it reflects the changing nature of our work environment. With Teams, Microsoft Teams is a hub. Microsoft 365 brings really the power of cloud to every person, giving them an integrated experience in a new world of work that's, I think, forever changed in comparison to any kind of pre-COVID, pre-pandemic work culture. So this is a huge shift in terms of how we communicate and where we put our data. It goes without saying that with this massive adoption of Office 365 in kind of a new work from home, post-pandemic, if I can say we're getting there, where we're always connected via the cloud, but don't actually connect directly to computers anymore. Quite simply, Office 365 has become the #1 attack surface. 2020 kind of forced this into reality. And I don't necessarily think this will change even in 2021 with some of the recent attacks we're seeing, because I genuinely believe we won't really ever go back to the way we were in terms of work environment pre-COVID. I believe we live in a world that's, forever changed based on some of the unique transitions we've seen over the last year and a half. If you stop to think what's in Office 365 and why it's so valuable, it's pretty much everything. It isn't just email. It's mainly things like OneDrive or SharePoint, which has become essentially the filing system for corporate America. Most companies use it religiously, and the majority of data, including a company's IP or patent secrets, their customer data, trade secrets, or even potentially crown jewels, essentially sit in a SharePoint or OneDrive environment. And then if you think of yourself personally, most of us, if we have adopted, the same ease and convenience that OneDrive provides or SharePoint, personally, we probably have most of our data there, so likewise, this is true of most companies. When you look at the Office 365 offering at a very high level, the suite of apps are all interconnected as part of that, overall environment. Essentially, this means anything of value for a public or private company relying on Microsoft probably sits in some respect within an Office 365 environment. This is true for Vectra, as a company, and most every company we speak to that actually utilizes Office 365. And at the root of all this, attackers follow the data using proven techniques, theft, ransomware, fraud, pivoting for even greater access or lateral spread via, trusted communication channels. And all that means is, once I've breached, an Office 365 environment, I'm on the inside. And so an email coming from an attacker is not necessarily under the same scrutiny as an external email might have been. But work from home, for example, has fostered some really new ways to get to the data. So how big is this problem when we talk about account takeover as potentially a preferred method for getting in an environment? These are numbers basically last year before 2020 when it was just starting to become a real problem. 40% of companies had experienced some kind of Office 365 account takeover. That's fairly staggering when you think about it. So what constitutes an Office 365 account takeover? We are constantly hearing about phishing, traditionally, which is the method of infection, how an adversary eventually gets onto some device or getting someone to click on something to install code to steal a password or get access to content. Account takeover is the concept of stealing a person's user identity and then being able to use that identity to impersonate them in order to access any resources associated with that individual. And you can see that if that's possible, that whole trust communication and channel, that becomes extremely challenging. Now, account takeover can occur within any software as a service or application, with the idea being, if I can take over an account and impersonate a user, I essentially have the same freedom of access as that user within that service. And that's why it's potentially, so attractive to attackers. And with a legitimate account, you can just imagine what's possible with Office 365. So this is what I'd say is the growing problem within Office 365. So in response to account takeover, the market typically responds with sort of a generic, if users leverage multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, they should be just fine. Now, although I agree that at a minimum, everyone should deploy some type of multi-factor authentication, it's a good call for covering the basics. The reality, it's not enough. And there are three ways people are getting around multi-factor with Office 365, just to make sure we understand why, attack takeover is so prevalent. It's important to kind of understand how easy potentially it is to circumvent some of what's referred to as the controls or security controls that are in place to protect users. So there are really three ways people are getting around multi-factor. There are challenges with legacy protocols, malicious Azure apps that facilitate, ongoing persistence is another challenge. And then the ability to stay signed in from a productivity feature or ease of use. Unfortunately, that also poses additional risk. Multi-factor authentication is built with current services in mind. Unfortunately, it does not support some of the legacy protocols that are still around. And Microsoft often leaves these legacy protocols on to support, legacy applications or allow backwards compatibility. And unfortunately, it's up to, you or your organization to actually turn off or disable any of the legacy protocols that pose a potential risk. They may be there, you may actually not even be using them, but they can be leveraged from an attacker perspective. So you have to be aware, do I have older legacy protocols running for backwards compatibility? And are they still actually required or being used? This makes full coverage for multi-factor authentication a real challenge in practice with some of these loopholes. Apps with permissions that can leverage, for example, OAuth to bypass multi-factor authentication and persist across a password reset. Yep, even after someone's account's been compromised and they reset their password, attackers can persist even in that same account. It is a convenience to not have to log in, obviously. This allows attackers to be able to pivot through already authorized systems unchallenged. So if you get that little request that says maintain, your sign-in for the next 30 days, just be careful, be aware of what you're doing. Because essentially you're saying, if I log in again, I don't want to be challenged from an authentication standpoint. But if for whatever reason your account's been taken over, you've just disabled that authentication. And so it's one less thing that the attacker has to actually challenge. If I can figure a way to get in after an authentication session, multi-factor authentication does not provide me any value. I'm going to state that again. If I can figure a way to get in after an authentication session, multi-factor authentication does not provide me any value. Something you should do in terms of multi-factor, something that you should enable, but it's definitely not foolproof. So couple this idea of a potential persistent token. So the idea, that someone can remain. So think of this in terms of a potential persistent token, say, for example, with your home network. It's not the same as your best of breed security or infrastructure sitting in your enterprise, right? I mean, I wish that I had the means and the capital to deploy that level of security at home. But even with the latest gadgets, oftentimes this is what's in practice. If you're like me, you're more than willing to spend a little money, but it's the 80-20 rule typically. I'm only leveraging 20% of the capability of most of the devices I purchase and deploy in my home network. Coverage is what I call partial at best. And nobody was really ready to turn their home networks into enterprise class security enclaves, pre or during the pandemic. And if you're like me, I actually get dirty stares from family and friends when I insist that they join the guest network and not my segmented primary home network. And oh, by the way, it's a 25-character passphrase for the password. People don't like those extra steps. So here's an example of details we've seen for what we call a bypass attack. So if you look at the diagram here and kind of follow that through, if I can start with a compromised account, that could be leveraging something like poisoning versus a traditional phishing exploit. Once on the inside, there is this perceived trust, something I referred to a little earlier. So the net result of that perceived trust is that defenses come right down. If I'm looking at my Office 365 inbox and I see an email that's got my company domain associated with it, I'm certainly a lot less questioning of that email and the validity of it versus an external email I receive. So that concept of perceived trust, where defenses come down, is a very real thing. Most folks do not have coverage for Office 365 or cloud. Only limited behavior, and the challenge with that is once an attacker is in, very limited behavior is really required by the attacker to progress. As you can see by the diagram, before someone can fully move into Office 365 to get to their objective. But there's not a lot of work that has to be done. It is hard to find attackers, and then on top of this, it's fairly difficult to find attackers once they transition, into the cloud. When you think about sort of our world and this hurried migration to kind of a better work from home in terms of access, security is one of the first things that has suffered with a fast transformation created by the pandemic, and it's a prime example of the pressure to get stuff done in order to keep the business moving. But unfortunately, security becomes a real afterthought. Hence why the average cost of data breaches continues to increase. So there we go. So let's talk about a couple different Office 365, attacker tactics. Let's dive into this a little bit and talk through some of this. So here's what I call the obvious. Here are some common tricks. These are the more kind of obvious things that attackers leverage. So concepts like search for email or through Teams, looking for files or passwords, maybe specific financial data. Being able to set up some type of email forwarding rule. And this provides, kind of ongoing visibility. I set that rule up, I get related content in my inbox in an automated way. Fraud via trusted communications, again, to customers or internal users. It's a lot easier for me to initiate some kind of fraudulent activity if I'm on the inside. And again, I have that perceived trust. And then things like the watering hole attacks, poisoning common files. Ransomware, who has not, heard of the ransomware attacks that have been in the news in just the last 2 or 3 months, continue to be on the rise. And then things like exfiltrating, high value email data. For example, initiating some kind of search that is looking for any kind of intellectual property, patent numbers, could be financial related, looking for, who's getting paid, and that sort of thing. So these are very obvious kind of common things. Let's talk a little bit about some of those vulnerabilities we spoke about before. So legacy protocols that we had mentioned being used to bypass multi-factor authentication. So here's a specific tool that was leveraged against, a MAPI service related to Office 365. And the goal was to essentially pivot from Office 365 to the endpoint to then further the attack on the network. So multi-factor, again, is built with current services in mind, but does not support some of the common legacy protocols. And I mentioned, it's typical that Microsoft often leaves these protocols on to support those older apps. And it's really upon the company or the user to be able to disable or turn those off to eliminate that potential risk. But that means you need to be aware and you need to know if, number one, you've got those older legacy protocols running for backwards compatibility, and if they're still required. So this makes full coverage for, again, multi-factor a genuine challenge in practice. Another common tactic for bypassing multi-factor is to trick users into installing a potential malicious app or OAuth app. And these are super powerful. And once installed, they give the attacker access typically for 90 days with no additional authentication challenge. And so the attacker has a valid token, even if the password is changed. You may wonder who would be foolish enough to install one of these apps. And my encouragement to you is never underestimate the power of social engineering or the lure of ease of use. If I can simplify something for you, if I can provide one less authentication process, taken, one-to-one doesn't seem like much, but if you look at that over multiple days, that ease of use lure is powerful. Let's talk a little bit about some of the malicious Azure apps that have taken center stage. So this tactic was featured in a campaign against an Australian company, and actually several Australian companies, and was widely attributed to China. This essentially took a social engineering approach, and the trick was to spoof an app from MailGuard 365, and which was widely used security tool in the target organizations. So again, the attacker knew their audience to the degree that they knew the use of this particular application would not be suspicious. The users thought they were doing the right thing to improve their security posture by, initiating what the attackers wanted. Instead, they were getting owned. Once installed, the attackers had persistent access and could read user profiles as well as read and manipulate emails. So again, now they're on the inside and they have a very trusted perspective in terms of their interactions with the rest of the individuals or accounts within a particular company. Attackers also like to live off the land in Office 365. So using built-in tools to remain hidden, just as they do in the traditional enterprise environment. One example is using the Office 365 eDiscovery compliance search tool. And if you're not familiar with this, essentially it enables a rapid search capability for targeted info across all of Office 365. So think of this as sort of built-in Google search for all of your Office 365 resources. So imagine searching for password or PWD across emails, Teams, and all files in SharePoint or OneDrive, and even OneNote notebooks, all in a single command. So it's extremely powerful. And once in, these are tools that are accessible for users within Office 365. So you can start to see how powerful, once somebody is in on the inside and actually has an established account, what they can do within an Office 365 environment. Another tool that is extremely powerful that I like to highlight is what's referred to as Power Automate. In earlier times, this was spoken about in terms of flow control or flows. And the concept there is I could create an automated workflow, and I can initiate that automation anytime a particular condition is seen or exists. So again, Power Automate is another great option for attackers trying to live off the land. Power Automate was created to automate day-to-day user tasks like managing email attachments or approval flows. That's why it was referred to at one point in time as flows. It's enabled by default in Office 365 tenants, and it can do really amazing things. And this is not just for users, but attackers as well. And again, people might think this is sort of an administrative tool, but this is actually tools that you would use to automate every time I, for example, get an email directed to me as the primary recipient from my manager. I may want to put that in a separate folder so that I can track that more closely. And so I could set up a Power Automate rule to initiate that process. Well, again, as a user, that's beneficial to me, but it's just as beneficial to attackers. So attackers might leverage it slightly different. So for example, they could leverage Power Automate for connecting over HTTP to a C2 channel, a command and control to send data to. They could also automatically sync OneDrive files to their own Google Drive. So it's owned by the attacker. And every time something gets updated to that OneDrive, it simply mirrors and syncs to an external drive for every single modification. Another option would be they could tweet all emails that include specific keywords. Power Automate allows you to facilitate those kinds of behaviors and automated workflows. With over 350 application connectors available and more being added every week, really, when you think about Power Automate and what it can do, and Office 365 in general, the options are pretty limitless. And Power Automate can also bypass DLP and other security controls. So from an attacker perspective, it's a great resource. So these techniques are actively being used in the wild, today. Microsoft themselves recently published an example of an advanced attacker who used these tools to help them live off the land. So these techniques were, things that they used to maintain complete Office 365 access for 213 days. So we're not talking about just a little bit of time. We're talking a significant presence where an attacker is in your environment, learning as much as they can about the value of your data and defining what their objective is as far as how they're going to target what's most of value to them. And it may be surprising, but Microsoft's security suite doesn't offer really any coverage for finding malicious Power Automate usage, nor do they give you any granular controls over which connectors can be used or by which users. Essentially, Power Automate is something that's enabled or disabled. It's just turn it on or switch it off. So what does Microsoft recommend from a security perspective? They simply recommend enabling multi-factor authentication, which by now you should recognize is essentially not enough. So if you had a compromised Office 365 account, how would you be able to determine that? That's one of the challenges. Well, the trick is to understand the correct way to apply machine learning and what problems you're trying to solve. Whether the task is driving a nail, fastening a screw, or detecting a hidden HTTP tunnel, it pays to have the right tool for the right job. So the wrong tool can increase the time to accomplish a task, can also waste valuable resources, or even worse. So when we talk about machine learning, there's a very fine art of balancing exactly, the right information at the right time. So leveraging the power of machine learning is not any different from using the right kind of tool. So in general, Vectra has adopted the philosophy of implementing the most optimal machine learning tool for each attacker behavior detection algorithm. So there's this concept of, if I can leverage machine learning, I can apply it, across my organization. The challenge is each, behavior can dictate a very different approach in terms of the actual algorithm or the machine learning model. So each method has its own strengths. The model best suited to finding, for example, a SQL injection against an internal database will not be the same model that is best suited to discerning a hidden HTTP tunnel or an attacker moving laterally via remote procedure calls. And if you look at what we mean in terms of durable coverage versus fast labeled coverage of known threats, if you sort of think of the fast labeled coverage of known attacks as a variance of, kind of a static signature, but a signature, if I modify a simple bit or byte, I've got now a different signature. It doesn't match the pattern. And so it can actually circumvent some kind of pattern, signature looking, signature, base tool. Whereas what we're trying to accomplish by looking at the problem of attackers in an environment by leveraging a behavior, what we're trying to address is the idea of durable coverage. A good example of this is when WannaCry hit several years ago. Because WannaCry leveraged a replication behavior that's been around since one of the first worms, Conflicker, was introduced to the internet. We had a machine learning model that picked up on the replication behavior. We were actually able to see WannaCry as it first was released. And then later we developed a ransomware behavioral model that was able to leverage some more detail about what WannaCry was doing specifically. But because we had that replication model, we were actually able to see that activity and behavior before we understood that it was actually a WannaCry. And so this is what we mean when we talk about durable coverage as opposed to, signatures or simple threat intelligence. We're looking at being able to develop a model that is able to provide coverage for multiple years as opposed to a single signature to try to address a specific behavior. That's good only for the duration of how long that particular exploit stays in fashion. So one of the things that we do, if you're not familiar with MITRE, MITRE is basically a framework by which to kind of address exploit coverage. And there's different approaches or different coverage models. Some of the coverage models look at different OS for system-based exploits. Some look at endpoint detection. And then Vectra, because we are a network detection and response solution, our detections or the exploits or the vulnerabilities that we are addressing all fall within that network space. So those are different than what MITRE dictates as far as coverage requirements for something like either OS or endpoint detection. So if you look at the network-based coverage that MITRE is saying is critical to ensure that you are limiting any security gaps within your environment, Vectra provides detections for about 85 to 90% of those exploits or requirements that MITRE is saying, are essential. And so these are some of the detections that we address. If you look at the green, you can kind of look at these, and the initial access, persistence, privilege escalation, that's just really progression of different techniques that are used in an attack. And then the items or the titles underneath those really represent different detection types or different areas where, the green is tactics covered by, Vectra specifically. And then the boxes in the white, we have adjacency where we leverage some integration capabilities with other security tools that could fit in your overall security stack to address those pieces. But the concept is what we do related to our detections maps very well back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework and what they call their matrix specifically for Office 365 coverage. So some of the things that we'll talk about here specifically as it relates to Office 365 is the ability to detect malicious access to any federated applications. So here, we're not just simply talking about Office 365 or Azure, AD, but we would be able to look at, these federated applications. So Box, Zoom, Salesforce, we would see some of the related activity associated with those additional solutions. And again, we're listing out the different detection types as we look at pre-access, access, and persistence. These are the different detection types. And if you're interested, we actually have a PDF that captures specific definition in terms of the Vectra platform associated with each of these detections. We kind of call out what it means, how we score them in terms of weighted, because they each get a score that contributes to a host or an account. And then we also talk a little bit about root cause for each of these, potential business impact. And then for supporting security analysts, we give them kind of a first or next step to be able to validate whether this activity is actually happening within their environment. So if you're interested, just let me know. I'll provide that as a resource. And then if we just follow the additional, evasion, discovery, lateral, exfil, and impact, when we talk about Office 365 specifically and the associated, apps within there, we get really specific in terms of the types of detections and what we're looking for within Office 365. So a lot of coverage related to Office 365. And again, as I mentioned before, we sort of map this back to the MITRE as the framework so that you can understand the extent of coverage. So if you sort of look on the right of this chart, it's Vectra detections in Office 365. MITRE ATT&CK framework has a T number where they assign, a particular exploit or coverage requirement based on a T number. And then if you look to the right, we're defining or kind of calling out the associated attack behavior. So if you look at, for example, the second one, suspicious sign-on activity, what we're calling out in terms of the T number, we've got T1078, and MITRE maps that to a valid account number in terms of T1078. And then we explain a little bit here about what we mean in terms of command and control. And essentially, we're saying an adversary has stolen a valid account and is using it as part of an attack, right? So this is where we come up with this particular detection in terms of suspicious sign-on activity. And again, I mentioned the strength of Power Automate, and so we have a detection associated with suspicious flow creation, and essentially an adversary is leveraging Power Automate as a persistence mechanism inside an environment. That behavior, our detection maps back to these different MITRE T numbers, right? Same thing for the mail forwarding, and then unusual eDiscovery search or eDiscovery exfiltration. So you get kind of the mapping back to MITRE, what we're detecting, how it correlates to a general framework that folks are using to assess their coverage and potential gaps, and then what we mean in terms of what we're capturing with that particular detection. Real quick, I mentioned Power Automate again, but Power Automate allows me to create a process and have it run automatically when certain conditions are met. This means anytime I see a particular value that's of interest to me as an attacker, I could automate the forwarding of that email to an external account or copy it up to a file share. eDiscovery also provides a powerful search mechanism that allows an adversary to search all across an accounts accessible, via OneDrive or SharePoint resources, or across all of the Office, 365 apps to find any content of value to a particular attacker. And then again, just a little bit about our coverage access across Office 365. It's a slightly different view on how this coverage is addressed with MITRE in terms of the MITRE we talked about on the slide before. But essentially, this is characterizing the specific behaviors and tactics within Office 365, and it's these specific types of behaviors that we have built our machine learning models and algorithms in order to detect when we see that they are active. Real quick, I know we're about 10 minutes before the top of the hour, but I just wanted to talk a little bit high level here before we kind of wrap things up. We do some quarterly reports when we look at or assess the data, and this is top 10 suspicious behaviors we saw within Office 365 in terms of what was prevalent from attacker behavior. And then, we see the top 10 are listed in terms of detections on the left. And then we put those detections in the different kind of behavioral buckets in terms of techniques, tactics that are being used as it maps to, the kill chain, or what's often referred to as the attack lifecycle. So reconnaissance, command and control, lateral, exfil. So those detections kind of fit into those category types, if you will. But it's interesting, if you look at this, risky exchange operation, suspicious sign-on activity being some of the highest, suspicious Azure AD operation. Again, we hit, suspicious Power Automate flow creation, redundant access creation. So, mirroring accounts potentially. Suspicious SharePoint operation, unusual eDiscovery search, suspicious mail forwarding. Why am I forwarding that mail? Is there a justification there? Account manipulation, and then again, eDiscovery, a suspicious eDiscovery exfil. So very real activity that occurs within Office 365, and very hard to detect unless you're looking specifically, for variance in these types of behaviors within your account environment. Real quick, this is a case study. It was a mid-sized manufacturer The target was some finance users. Obviously, the objective was for was fraud. Initial access, this is where legacy protocol was brute forced. And ultimately what happened was there were mail rules to steal info and evade. So what happened was there was emails being forwarded related to DocuSign and specific payment invoices, as well as there was actions to delete emails related to password or security to, again, obfuscate what was happening. And the outcome was using Vectra, the rules were deleted and the passwords reset before any documents were forwarded. But that activity was detected, and the way in which we detected it, the specific detections were brute force, the suspicious sign-on, some risky exchange operations, and this suspicious mail forwarding. Those were the specific detections that the Vectra platform alerted on related to the Office 365 accounts. And then underneath each of those detections, there's a little bit more granular explanation of what we actually saw or what that particular detection or alert found from a behavioral standpoint. And then another simple case study. Here's a research university. This was a medical research group, and obviously this was early in the pandemic, and this was associated with COVID research. The initial access was driven through a spear phishing to install a fake calendar optimization app. There was lateral spread with the phishing emails to trusted internal contacts. And again, once the internal contacts, once that happens, right, defenses come down. The outcome was it was a malicious OAuth app. We were fortunate to be able to detect that early, so we were able to take that malicious OAuth app and remove it, as well as the phishing messages were deleted. Detections that fired or were brought to the surface was both the suspicious app and the internal phishing. And we were able to kind of prevent that from progressing to a more serious state. So kind of in wrapping up, there's multiple things that you can do to keep your Office 365 deployment, safe. And when it comes to Vectra, we detect and stop the largest attack vector in Office 365. We talked a little bit about, when account takeover was increasing in occurrence, we were registering initially early on 40% of all users' accounts being vulnerable. And then here you see 30% of organizations suffer from account takeovers every month. So it's important to understand attacker behavior and account privileges in SaaS applications to be able to prevent or stop breaches. And then attackers don't operate in silos. Your security shouldn't either. We give you the ability to track attacker activity, pivoting between your on-prem data center, infrastructure as a service, as well as software as a service. And then Microsoft security telemetry can be overwhelming and feel a little bit disjointed. It's valuable, and we complement very well what Microsoft is doing from a security standpoint. But machine learning models absolutely do help. Behavioral models are able to find attackers who are able to easily bypass defenses. So I'm going to wrap up there. I appreciate being able to deliver this information and background about some of the fundamentals related to account takeover in Office 365.